last year I was asked to write a history of garden composts, and there had been questions from gardeners in historic gardens what composts had looked like at different times and in different environments, where they used to be placed, what they contained, and how they were managed. And I've used printed sources from the 1650 to 1980, garden manuals, household manuals, and economic dictionaries. Everything described in manuals does not have to be real. So I have relied on garden archaeology for comparison, as Karin Lindgren has already told us today. The word compost is found in several Western European languages and has its origin in the Latin compositus, which means compound, mixed or blended. The oldest evidence in Swedish I have found is from 1731. Johan Kammaker had been on a 4-year study trip in England before he wrote his garden manual. En till sitt kära fäderneslands tjänst och nytta utgiven trädgårdsman. Kammaker uses the word compost, but in the English spelling, and he translates it as mixture. The starting point for authors of garden manuals during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries have been larger manor houses in the country. There would have been plenty of space, preferably between the manure pile and the kitchen garden, for piles of different compost materials. On the estates, nature would be varied with lakes, streams, sandpits, bogs, meadows and forests, where the gardener could collect materials for his different cultures. In practice, there was always competition between the agricultural fields and the garden for manure, which meant that the gardener had to make the manure last longer by adding leftovers from other activities. Bark and sawdust from the sawmill, bones, horse and blood from the slaughter, ash from fireplaces, etc. This list is from Kammaker's book, and as you can see, he recommends both natural materials like sea sand and mud, and also human leavings as ash from the fireplaces, and fur and leather and cloths. Another option than piles was to bury the manure, the compost in a pit. There, manure, ash, leaves, rotten wood, weeds, and other things were mixed with soil, and dirty water was led to the pit so it would not dry out. In the 17th century books, there is talk of animal manure, which needed to be 2 to 3 years old before it was used. So the gardeners must have observed decaying processes. The writers make no difference between kinds of decay. Everything that was broken down was said to rot. The manure recommended was cow, sheep, and chicken. That was the best to fertilize a garden with. But deep digging of the beds, so that mixing new soil with old was considered quite as good as fertilizing. And in this picture, you can see 2 women spreading good topsoil in a bed. They could quite easily have been spreading manure as well. During these times, mostly men were hired on year contracts, but women were hired to do extra work, and usually the dirtiest and the heaviest. Kammaker also recommended that a garden owner ought to take care of all dead cattle and collect them in a grave and cover with soil until they had rotted. And rotted animals then became the best manure of all. A simpler alternative was to bury a dead cat or dog among the roots of a fruit tree to fertilize it. When it came to human excrement as manure, all the authors of garden books agreed that it was the most nutritious animal manure. Kammaker gave it a religious explanation. Because man was the highest of God's creations, a recommended solution was to mix the excrement with swept up debris from the floors in the houses, such as sand, spruce twigs, leaves, and dust. Several authors also suggesting placing a pile of soil or leaves or peat and sand and other dry garbage from the garden next to the latrine. Every evening, this material would be shoveled over to cover it with. In this way, the smell was avoided and the dung was fermented together with a dry material. After a week, the manure was moved to a pile and mixed again with other materials. At this time, everyone had a chamber pot under their beds to pee in during the night. These pots were collected in the morning by a maid and the contents poured on the manure pile or the compost heap. Urine mixed in a barrel with washing and dishwater could be a good liquid fertilizer. And here we see a woman mixing this liquid fertilizer. Again, the dirtiest and heaviest work. In the 18th century farmers' gardens, most of the manure was used primarily for the vegetable plots, while the fields received much less or none at all. In the 19th century, the fields were given more priority. Manure piles were collected there, but seldom compost heaps. For owners of really small farms, it was always possible to have at least a pig or some chickens that could provide manure apart from the latrine. The people ate everything there was to eat. The small amount of waste from the kitchen and the garden was given as feed to chickens and pigs. There was no organic waste to compost. If there was anything at all, it was put in the manure pile. Western Europe's colonization of other continents and improved communications made plant nutrition a commodity in world trade. From the 1820s, trade in bone meal increased. It was produced both in local stamp mills and in larger factories. From the 1840s, guano was imported to Europe to be used as fertilizer. In the middle of the 19th century, factories were set up around the cities to convert human and animal manure, fish, ash, and offal into artificial fertilizers that were sold to farmers and market gardens. At the same time, chemistry was developed and a new science was used in agriculture. I'm sorry. And a new science was used in agriculture to find inorganic resources for the production of nitrogen fertilizers. Authors of garden books knew about artificial fertilizers, which they considered might be used in case of lack of natural manure. During the 19th century, more citizens acquired villa gardens. These contained advanced cultivation managed by gardeners, but the residential plots were considerably smaller than a country estate. The gardeners wanted an equally effective composting, but in a smaller space. So they laid a mixed pile instead of several piles. The small area may also be the reason why the compost heap was recommended to be placed out of sight and of smelling range from the ornamental garden. Karin's picture showing the compost bins at the end of the garden was for inner city gardens, which was very small, and the villa gardens were placed at the outskirt of the gardens, where there was more room. And with this one and only compost heap, the different materials were alternated in layers. The size and shape, round or oblong, varied, but they should not be laid too high. A maximum of 2 meters was recommended in the books, and the width from between 1.5 to 3 meters. The length depended on how much material was available and also the space. A depression in the middle was recommended so that rainwater or liquid manure would sink into the compost and not run off. The compost heap should be turned over at least twice a year. Some writers recommended every month. The turned heap could be covered with soil, and to look neater, it could be sown with cucumbers, pumpkins, spinach, New Zealand spinach, or nasturtium in different colors. All dirty water from the kitchen, from washing and cleaning as well as urine, was mixed in barrels and used to water both plants and composts. It was used especially for plants that needed extra nitrogen, such as tomatoes, cucumbers, cabbages, lettuce, and spinach, as well as lawns. Shortcut lawns were a novelty around 1900 in villa gardens and city parks. And in this picture, we see a woman who is pouring out liquid manure. And in this book from the 1910s, it was recommended that you would dig a small channel or small holes and then pour in the liquid manure, and after that cover it up again with the soil. This way it would neither smell nor it would evaporate. During the 19th century, it was noticed that compost increased humus content in the soil. In the early 20th century, the usefulness of compost as a fertilizer was questioned after chemical analysis had showed that compost only contained small amounts of nutrients. The compost was redefined as a soil improver. Everyone could observe that humus improved soil, and humus was considered necessary for a good cultivation result, even if the cause was not yet clear. From around 1900, garden newspapers had advertisements for various types of commercial fertilizers. It could say, "Do not let your plants starve," and other equally and other such I forgot the word. All right, I continue. The authors of garden manuals were still critical and emphasized that artificial fertilizers were only a complement. Cattle manure and compost were still needed to maintain the humus content of the topsoil, and without humus, the soil would be depleted. Other substances were introduced as alternatives. Peat was considered the cheapest and best soil improver during the 20th century. Bark mold began to be used in the 1960s. They even tried plastic, like plastic foam or styrofoam. It was known in the early 20th century that bacteria and various microorganisms played an important role in the decomposition of compost. Research has shown that microlife in the compost is what improves the topsoil and makes the nutrients available to plants. The first book about garden compost in Swedish came in 1979, and this picture was illustrating it, or as perhaps more as a cartoon made by Veltman, and it said its title was Livat I komposten, which can mean lively in the compost or perhaps living it up in the compost. When it was at this time, people began talking about the living earth, and it was not considered as an exaggeration. When the compost began to be appreciated again, it could be given pride of place in the garden. It need not be hidden away. Some seem to have become more enchanted with the compost itself and the soil than by the plants that could be grown in it. And today's options are many on a scale between the extremes of those who concentrate on the compost and try to be self-sufficient, and those who cover the existing soil with plastic and then place pallet collars and buy already mixed soil in plastic bags. This article, I have not quite finished it yet, but as for advice on composting in historic gardens, I think it would be of great interest to gardens visitors today to be able to show how to take care of leftovers and rubbish through reuse, repair, reworking, and composting. Some methods from the past are already in practical use. For example, mulltoa. I'm not sure how to translate that. It could be soil toilets. You poo in one end and then it comes after a month or two, it comes out. Also using urine as a liquid fertilizer. It's in all the garden papers today. And the use of biochar. As Marit just said, it has been used before, mostly in agriculture. But the farmers could herd their animals to a place where they had been making charcoal, but the coal was already taken away. But leave the animals overnight on top of the remaining char. And then when they had fertilized it, they would dig it up and take it out to the fields. When choosing methods and forms for compost in historic gardens, the gardener must take into account the type of garden in question and the time period to be shown. If it is a manor house from the 18th century, several piles with different materials can be laid up to show the handling of compost and manure at that time. But there was a question about could it be put in the kitchen garden, and that was not recommended. And that was because people thought that the compost would grow of itself worms and other vermin that could eat the garden plants. So the compost should be kept outside of the kitchen garden until it was already broken down to a nice structure. If it is a farm hamlet from the 19th century, the lack of compost must be a part of the story of life in that hamlet. And there will be more. This is a very short summary of the article, and it will be published together with an article of Katarina Sjöberg, which is the next speaker, by the University of Gothenburg, together in a little book about composting, and it will be come out early 2023, I think, in Swedish. But if there is a great demand of translation, maybe it can be fixed.